All right, guys, so today we're going to be looking at the binding of Isaac. Why don't we go ahead and start with the text itself? Genesis 22, verses 1 through 14, I believe. I'll give you guys a second to look that up. Genesis 22, 1 through 14. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood, and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it will be provided. So, the objection basically goes as follows. Okay, we've all heard stories or people doing things and saying, God told me to do it. Okay, so there's an example, popular one, of Andrea Yates or Lainey. I get confused. I don't know which woman it is. But it's a story of a mother who murdered her children, and she said, God made me do it. We all respond to this with shock, with disgust, and denial, right? She was crazy. God didn't command her to do that. But is she really that crazy to believe God commanded to do such a thing? To paraphrase Kierkegaard, the philosopher Kierkegaard, imagine a madman being brought into a church sermon where the preacher is preaching on the binding of Isaac. The preacher fervently expounds about the fact that Abraham is such a great man of faith and that he was willing to give God his best. And so the madman, wanting to be great and wanting to obey, he rushes home, gets his son, and murders him. When the congregation finds out, they're shocked, they're disgusted. When the preacher hears it, he's appalled that someone would take him at his word. You see, Abraham had a right to be a great man and thus to do what he did. But when another does the same, it is a sin, a heinous sin. What can we say about this objection? First, I think it's useful to write out the objection because that's very emotionally charged. But let's see what the essence of the objection is. So, the objection is basically that there is an inconsistent triad found in this story. Okay? Basically, these three statements, you can't believe them or hold them all at the same time. So statement 1, God's command to do X obligates person Y to do X. Statement 2, it is wrong to kill innocent human beings. And then statement 3, well, God commanded Abraham to take an innocent human life. Okay, the objector is saying, Christian, you're committed to all these three, yet there's a contradiction when you affirm them all at the same time. What can we say about statement 1? We're not going to discuss or dispute statement 1 because, well, as you guys, it should be familiar with divine command theory that I presented to you guys a couple of weeks ago. But I think the Christian is obviously committed to statement 1, right? If God tells you you have to do something, you're obligated to do that. Okay, I don't really see how the Christian can get around that. So today we're basically going to focus our attention to statement 2 and statement 3. Specifically, Copan resolves the issue exegetically, which means we're going to have to do a bit of Sunday school. So if you'll recall, when we spoke about the narratives months ago, how there are 3 levels to narratives. There is the individual story, right, like the binding of Isaac. But then there is the second level narrative, which talks about, well, how does this tie into what God is doing with his covenant people? And then there's a third, the broadest level, which is the meta-narrative, right? Which is the arc of what God is trying to do throughout history. And this is basically what Paul Copan is telling us. Yes, that's the command, but we need to look at this command in context, okay, in the context of the story, okay? There is an easy way out. We're not going to take it, but just to let you guys know, there is an easy way out. What does statement 3 assume? That God literally commanded, that this story is literally true. Okay? That's what statement 3 is assuming. Some biblical scholars say, no, actually this is a parable that God told the Israelites in an age where child sacrifice was rampant to teach them that they shouldn't worship God in this way. There you go, see, problem resolved. That story didn't literally happen. But I think this raises other problems for us, and that's not the route I or Copan took. So let's start with the meta-narrative. So let's take the 20,000 or the bird's eye view of things. Okay. Copan says that the theme of faith binds the Pentateuch, so the first 5 books of the Bible, together. And this theme is developed by contrasting Abraham and Moses. Okay? Abraham is the positive example of faith. Even though Abraham didn't have the law, we read in Genesis 15 that he believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. Genesis 26:5 says, Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. That's Mount Sinai terminology, but this is before the law. So what is the point here? That even without the law, Abraham kept the intention of the law because he lived by faith. On the other hand, Moses had the law, but he failed in his faith. Specifically, right, Moses died in the wilderness because of the unbelief he and Aaron demonstrated at Kadesh, the incident where Moses struck the rock. Right? Listen to God's rebuke in Numbers. Because you, Moses and Aaron, have not believed me to treat me as holy before Israel, you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given. Right? What's the problem? That he struck the rock? Well, according to here, it's not that he struck the rock. It's you have not believed. It was a matter of faith. Okay? Whatever we make of Paul Copan's contrast, or to put it differently, we don't have to bash Moses in order to make the point Copan is trying to make, which is that clearly Abraham is an example of trust in God. He is known as the father of faith, right? And for good reason. And this is exactly how Paul interpreted Abraham in light of his encounter with Christ. Abraham served as an illustration across the ages of how God's people should live. We are to approach God trustingly, depending on his grace and sufficiency, rather than putting confidence in ourselves. Okay? That's the broader point. Now let's go to the nearer context. That's what Paul Copan says. And basically here we start with Genesis 12. And what do we have in Genesis 12? Well, we have Abraham's call. God calls Abraham. He says, "The Lord said to Abraham, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." So what's the command? Abraham, leave your family, leave everything you know. Okay? He's not just leaving a place. Think about this. If I'm not mistaken, Abram was 75 years. Imagine living 75 years in one place. God comes to you and says, leave everything you know, your customs, your heritage, and go to okay, where to, God? You're telling me to pack my bags. Oh, I'll show you. Don't worry. What does Abraham do? Well, we know he obeys God. But the command is tied to a promise. What's the promise? Well, we have here that Abraham will be the father of a nation, and that nation is going to have its own land, its own country. Guys, what is a nation made out of? People. Okay, you can't have a nation without people. Okay, so the obvious implication of God's promise is that Abraham is going to have descendants. Okay? Now, we skip forward a bit to Genesis 15, and what happens? God basically reiterates his promise to Abraham, and he clarifies things. So, of course, God makes a promise, time elapses, so Abraham's like, God, you told me I was going to be a great nation, you were going to bless me greatly, and we were going to have a country and stuff, but I still don't have a son. I don't have anything. In fact, the heir of everything I have is my servant. Okay, and God clarifies. He says, no, don't worry. Your heir will be a son who is your own flesh and blood. Okay, and here he actually makes explicit, right, the fact that he's going to have numerous descendants, as numerous as the stars, right? God tells Abraham, hey, can you count the stars? And Abraham starts writing. God's like, no, okay, stop. You can't. The point is that they're going to be numerous. Not only does God clarify, but he also makes this promise formal. Okay, so think about it as Rydell and I have an agreement, an unspoken agreement. It's, yeah, this is going to happen. And now here, God is saying, okay, let's make a contract, a written contract. Okay, what does God do? God tells Abraham, get some animals, cut them in half, and then put them opposite to each other. And what did God do? God walked through the animals. Okay, this is a weird scene, but biblical scholars basically what do they make of this? They say that this was supposed to be like a divine self-curse. So, may I be like this cut up animal if I don't fulfill my promise. Okay? Right? So God is telling Abraham, so we already have God's word, which should be enough, right? God can't lie. God can't break his promises. That's contrary to his nature. It is impossible. Logically impossible. The strongest of all possibilities for God to break his promise. And yet, God condescends because he sees, right, what he's asking of Abraham. And he says, here, I'm going to enter into a covenant with you. I'm passing through these animals so that you see that I am serious about what I'm telling you. So what is the significance of this? Now we know that these numerous descendants is going to come from a biological son, from Abram's biological son. And this son is obviously going to grow up to be old enough to have his own children. Because if Abram has a son, but then that son dies off, there are no numerous descendants. Okay? Then we have Hagar and Ishmael. And Sarah got creative. Okay? Right? This is what happens to us when we get a bit antsy. We're like, God has told us to do this, but it's taken some time, so maybe I need to help God out. Okay, that's what Sarai thinks. She's like, Abraham, we're not getting any younger. Okay? God said the son of the promise would be your flesh and blood. But he didn't say my flesh and blood. Okay? So she figures they can have a son through a surrogate mother, Hagar, her maidservant. Okay? Copan says that this turns out to be a misconception. You guys get it? Knee slapper. Okay. So put a pin on this. Then what happens? Well, after this incident, Abraham has another encounter with God. Okay? Where God reiterates his promise once again to make Abraham the father of many nations and give his descendants the land of Canaan. Okay? Indeed, here God changes Abraham's name to Abraham, which means father of nations, and Sarai's name to Sarah, which means mother of nations. Okay? But Abraham now is very cognizant that he is 99 years old and Sarah is 89 years old. So he gets a little exasperated and he exclaims, oh, that Ishmael, his other son now that he had, might live before you. Okay, God, you promised me that I would have descendants. Just do it through Ishmael. God responds, yeah, he lives, don't worry. Okay, but no, you're going to have a son. You're going to name him Isaac, and my covenant will be established through him and his descendants. What do we have here now? A clear, crystal clear, God is saying, my promise is going to be fulfilled through Isaac, okay, and his descendants, which means that Isaac is going to live long enough to what? To have children. Okay. Now, Hagar and Ishmael again, okay, enter the picture. There's, of course, who would have expected a rivalry between Hagar and Sarah, and then Ishmael basically bullies Isaac, okay, since he's bigger than him. Sarah gets fed up, tells Abraham, send them away. But Abraham obviously doesn't want to do this. That's his son, okay? And he knows that sending them off in the wilderness, the desert, a woman and a child, it means probably certain death. But then God appears, tells Abraham, don't worry, I'm going to take care of them. Okay, Ishmael, in fact, is going to become a great nation. And so, what does Abraham do? He gets up early. That language should seem familiar. And goes and does what God commands him. Right? So without God's command to send them away, it would have been wrong for him to send them away. But that's not what we have here, right? God assures him. Now let's look at the Genesis 22 text itself. So we went from the meta-narrative to the surrounding context, right, of Genesis. And now we're going to look at Genesis 22 itself, and then we're going to come to a conclusion. So Copan says that we need to know four things, or that four things emerge about God's character as we read through Genesis 22, what we read at the beginning. First, we are immediately tipped off to the fact that God is testing Abraham. Verse 1. Of course, Abraham doesn't know. This is just a test. But we see here that God doesn't intend for Isaac, to be sacrificed. Second, even the hard command to Abraham is cushioned by God's tenderness. What do I mean here? That God's command, God's directive here is unusual. I don't think it's paralleled elsewhere. He says, please take your son. Okay? Some commentators see the language here as so gentle that they conclude that if Abraham hadn't had enough faith to follow through, he wouldn't have been disobedient to God. Because it's like if God were saying, please, I beg you, do this. Okay? Third, God reminded Abraham of his covenant faithful when he said, your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac. Wait, doesn't Abraham have another son? Yes. So God is reminding Abraham that he's been faithful, that he had the miracle child Isaac, and that his promises to have numerous descendants are going to come through Isaac. But he's reminding him of his covenant faithfulness. And then a fourth indication of God's faithful character is that God is sending Abraham to a mountain in the region of Moriah. And Moriah is derived from a Hebrew word which meant provide, see, show. So we can say, God said to Abraham, go to the mountain in the region of provide, see, or show. Okay? So in the very word Moriah, we have a hint of salvation and deliverance. The Bible actually establishes that Abraham was able to trust God in a very deep way. What I mean, look how Hebrews puts it. Hebrews puts it pretty dramatically. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. Okay? So all of this leads us to conclusion. The context leads us to the conclusion that statement 3 actually needs to be revised. Okay, so God commanded Abraham to kill his son in a context where Abraham knew his son would not die, but live on after the incident. You see what happened here? I'm going to repeat that. So we have statement 3, okay, which is God's command. But now after that, we need to put in a context where Abraham knew his son would not die, but live on after the incident. So commanding killing, Matthew Flanagan says, commanding killing in this context needs to be shown as immoral for the objection to gain traction. Okay? So let's turn our attention to statement 2. Okay? It is wrong to kill innocent human beings. So Copan approaches this in 2 ways. Here's the first. He says, are there any conditions in which taking an innocent human life would be morally justified? And Copan says, yes, most people would say yes. He gives the example of an ectopic pregnancy, which is when the fertilized human egg remains and grows in the woman's fallopian tube. If the embryo continues to grow without intervention, the mother will surely die. So ethicists generally agree in this tragic case, it is morally permissible to take innocent human life, and they give a self-defense reason in order to protect the mother's life. Without intervention, both of them will die. Okay? Copan gives another example, which are the September 11 terrorist attacks. He says when the 4 planes were hijacked, they put more lives at risk than the innocent passengers on the planes. So what did the president do? He gave orders to shoot down the planes. Again, while this is tragic, if you recall our discussion a couple of weeks ago between the different values and duties, it's helpful here. While this is tragic, such a command was justified in an attempt to stop the killing, right, of many more innocent persons. But let's say that you don't buy these exceptions, okay? Let's take another line of reasoning. Matthew Flanagan again says, most of the ethical prohibitions that hold in the actual world do so because of certain facts about the world. Let's put this in a question form. What if the physical structure of the world turned out to be different from the way we happen to find it? Okay? To simplify that even more, what would happen to our moral obligations if the physical structure of the world were different? So for example, if we were on a roof and gravity as we know it was completely different, so that if you push me, I wouldn't fall to my death. And so that you push me in this hypothetical world and I just float around. See how pushing someone off a building, which we would typically think now is wrong, wouldn't be wrong in that world, or at least not that bad, right? Woo, how fun, right? I'm floating around, okay? Let me give you a more serious example. I don't know if it's more serious, but hitting someone on the head is wrong, okay? Because in the world we actually live in, this causes pain and harms people. However, if the world were different, if hitting someone in the head actually improved his health, his quality of life, and even his IQ, that's what some people thought with, I don't want to pick, with Stephanie. That's what Stephanie's parents thought. Okay. So if that's the case, and hitting someone in another world, right, hitting someone on the head actually improved that person's health, IQ, and all of these benefits, then hitting someone in the head in that world really wouldn't be bad, or at least not that big of a deal. Let's take this further. Okay, let's get a little more bizarre with a thought experiment provided by John Hare. He says, say that God willed that we should kill each other at the age of 18. At which point, God would bring us back to life and in robust health. If so, it is quite plausible that killing people at this age wouldn't be wrong, or at least not that big a deal. So let's apply that to Abraham. If Abraham knew God would fulfill his covenant promises, then Abraham's taking an innocent human life according to God's command was morally permissible. In other words, this statement to it is wrong to kill innocent human beings typically holds in usual context, okay? But that's not what we have here. In this context, we have a God who acts in history, who makes promises, who makes good on them, and has morally sufficient reasons for doing what he does. Okay? And in this case, we have the context that this is what the Bible tells us. The critic is assuming the Bible is telling the truth. So the Bible tells us in Hebrews that Abraham knew that his son will come back to life. Okay? So in this context, I think the objection falls apart. So while I think we have succeeded, right, in giving a logical defense of the binding of Isaac, and one that I think is faithful to the text, we can go further and give a response that is emotionally satisfying as well, right? Because like in the problem of evil, it is not an overstatement to say that Christian philosophers have completely refuted the problem of evil in the logical sense, right? And that it's a contradiction. But there remains the emotional distress of people who live in a world in which God is supposed to be, right, king and sovereign of, but they're still suffering. So the Jewish writer Elie Wiesel, probably mispronounced that, who wrote about his horrifying experiences at Auschwitz, which is the infamous concentration camp, he recounts one event that is particularly moving. He says, the SS hanged 2 Jewish men and the youth in front of the whole camp. The men died quickly, but the death throes of the youth lasted for half an hour. Where is God? Where is he? Someone asked behind me. As the youth still hung in torment in the noose after a long time, I heard the man call again, where is God now? And I heard a voice inside myself answer, where is he? He is here. He is hanging there on the gallows. And that is the type of God we have in Christianity, right? A God who suffers with us. In the case of the binding of Isaac, where is God? We could say he is there, sending his own son, sacrificing his own son. What he prohibited Abraham from doing, God did with his own son. So we see that the story of Abraham and Isaac actually foreshadows God the Father offering up Jesus as a sacrifice. We can get really into deep in the weeds with this, but I'll just go over the parallels, right? So Isaac is Abraham's only son whom you love. And what do we have in the New Testament? Jesus is the Father's beloved son. He says, this is my beloved son with whom I am well pleased. And John 3:16 says, for God gave his one and only son. The language is almost identical. Okay. Isaac carries the wood of Mount Moriah. What does Jesus do? He carries the cross on his back. Abraham says God will provide a lamb. Who is the lamb? Jesus is the lamb. Isaac symbolically comes back from the dead. Jesus literally dies but resurrects. Okay. The sacrifice is prepared on Mount Moriah, later the site of the Jerusalem temple. Where is Jesus' sacrifice? Right outside. Okay? Some people go on and on with this. Yet we know that. So in the crucifixion of Jesus, we see the Father sends the Son, who gives himself willingly for the sake of our salvation, and the Holy Spirit applies the benefits of his Son's saving work. Right? Some people will object, wait, but that just means that God bullied Jesus. Okay, this is pretty silly because you're saying Jesus is the eternal almighty God. Okay, he's not a defenseless little child. And the New Testament makes it pretty clear that Jesus says, no one takes my life from me. I give it up willingly, voluntarily. So let's end with a prayer.